Okay, good morning. This meeting is being conducted pursuant to New York State Open Meetings Law, Public Office Law, Section 100, etc. For purposes of this meeting, I shall designate Julia Lee as our recording secretary. Today we have before us consideration of the following proposed amendments to Board Rules 4-01, Board Rules Chapter 3, Board Rules 1-18, and Board Rules 107. We're going to start with Board Rules 4-05. So we have before us consideration of the proposed amendments to Board Rules 4-05. Julia, you want to say 2 sentences about this?
This was presented to the board back in November about the new filing deadlines for candidates who are seeking matching funds from the Campaign Finance Board. It was reviewed by the Mayor's Office of Operations and the Law Department, and other than stylistic changes, there are no substantive edits that were made. So now it's being presented back to the board so we can go to a public hearing.
Great. Any comments from the board or staff on the draft?
I just have one question, maybe
Yes.
this is crazy, about this shall or must sentence.
Yeah.
I knew it was coming. Can you just, does this go in every end of the statement of purpose, or only if the word shall or must is in the rule?
Well, there is some correspondence between all the parties because there is no shall or must in this rule. We wondered why this was necessary. They
Right.
basically responded back, saying that it was protocol.
Okay.
I think there's been maybe some changes to what's going to happen because there's been some subsequent rules after this was reviewed where they don't put this in. So
Okay.
they seem to be a little bit waffling. We fought back and forth, but it didn't seem to be something that we were going to fight that strongly
Right,
about.
it's not-
So
it
this
doesn't
is
even
where we
apply.
are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions or comments? Okay, so I call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendment to Board Rule 4-05 as the final rule.
So moved.
In a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the motion for adoption of proposed amendments as presented as the final rule has passed. Okay, let us now move on to Board Rules Chapter 3, which deals with affiliated not-for-profit organizations. Again, something that we've seen before. Chris, you want to tell us a little bit about this and where we are in the process, maybe more appropriately?
Absolutely. So the board held a public hearing on January 7th to receive comments on the proposed amendments to the board rules regarding not-for-profit organizations affiliated with elected officials. The board received one comment from reInvent Albany that in staff view does not require any changes to the proposed rule. The comment requests first that the board establish and publish a formula by which affiliated organizations calculate the percentage of expenses used for elected official communications. This formula is already established in the administrative code and thus doesn't need to be reiterated in the board rules. The comment also requests that the board release certain information to the city's open data portal. Not all of the information requested in the comment is required by Chapter 9 to be reported to the board. But the information that is reported to the board pursuant to Chapter 9 will appear on the Open Data Portal in the near future. So we're in the process of getting that to the Open Data Portal. And so the proposal before the board contains edits that are only conforming to reflect that the rule will be a final rule. Once that gets published in the city record, it will go effective 30 days from that date of publication.
Okay.
Have the must.
We got this one in under the wire, huh?
All right,
Oh,
this
I
came
got
in,
it.
this,
Okay,
this,
final
this
rule,
was
okay.
reviewed back in October.
Any comments from the board or staff on the draft of the proposed amendments to Board Rules Chapter 3? Hearing none, I ask for a motion that we adopt.
Move.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed. The motion for adoption of proposed amendments as presented as the final rule has passed. Chris, you're still with us? Now we
Yes.
have something new on
Yes.
endorsements, right?
Exactly. So as part of its ongoing review of the board's rules, practices, and advisory opinions, staff brings to the board the proposed rule regarding use of city title and promotional materials produced by or on behalf of a non-city product, program, or entity. The example of such a use that we've encountered pretty frequently, one in which the board has frequently advised public servants, is for a public servant to provide a book blurb on behalf of an agency. This proposed rule would mirror the
On
board's
behalf of a city agency or behalf of
using their city
publishing?
title for a book blurb.
It's not the city agency's book.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
Exactly. The proposed rule would mirror the board's rule on public servants fundraising on behalf of nonprofit organizations. So specifically, any use of title would have to meet 4 criteria. First, there has to be a demonstrable nexus between the product, program, or entity and the mission of the public servant's agency. Second, neither the agency head nor the endorsing public servant may be associated with either the entity or the an employee of the entity that's the subject of the endorsement. Third, the public servant's agency head must approve the endorsement. And last, if the materials do involve fundraising, the conduct must comply with Board Rules Section 114, the fundraising rule.
What's an example of a demonstrable nexus?
So, for example, a health department official, blurbing a book that involves, their city work, that involves their city research, and that the health commissioner decides that
Has to be their city work or is supposed to just health?
no, it can be, it has to be closely related, so it can be, highlighting,
So let's say that,
anti-smoking measures, or something like that.
okay, could it be about pandemics, even though
Sure.
that person's not working on it?
I-
And what if it's about another subject? In other words, let's say a deputy commissioner in health has been asked to blurb a book about education policy.
I think there would have to be a nexus between their
Well,
portfolio.
is the answer no?
Under the rule, it would be. They could do it as a private individual,
Right. and-
if they're affiliated with if they're an adjunct professor at a university, they would be able to use their university affiliation, but they wouldn't be able to use a city title to endorse.
So you could blurb anything as long as it doesn't say deputy commissioner or assistant
Yes.
commissioner underneath it?
Yes.
Okay. So if they want to add deputy commissioner or assistant commissioner or whatever, then you have to have some title. agency.
That's exactly it. This is for the use of the city title, which is a
Okay.
city resource.
Right.
In some cases, we require an agency head to get approval of the deputy mayor to do something.
Yes.
We don't do that here.
We don't do that here, and that mirrors the fundraising rule, where this is not necessarily the commissioner, an agency head taking some action that's primarily for themselves. That's usually the circumstances by which the board requires deputy mayor approval. So for instance, travel by a commissioner, or having a second position, or performing work on behalf of a nonprofit organization that they are doing. This is more, like with agency fundraising, this seemed to staff more to be a question of agency functioning rather than the activities of the agency head. Certainly, if the board would prefer, that's absolutely an option for this rule. But that was our thinking in making this initial call.
No, because you could have a situation, for example, say there's a book about housing policy,
Yes.
and then the commissioner of HPD
Mhm.
writes a blurb saying,
Yes.
The commissioner thinks you would be essentially expressing a policy.
Yes.
People would ascribe to the city of New York.
That's exactly.
That's
That's exactly it, and that's generally what agency heads are responsible for doing. And so that, because it is more of a determination of policy rather than an individual responsibilities or individual, private interests, that's sort of the line that we've drawn in requiring deputy mayor approval.
Just going back to the nexus question for a second.
Yes.
I guess the statement of basis and purpose cites, looks like 4 advisory opinions. It might be useful to lift the language from those advisory opinions that indicate what a demonstrable nexus is. In other words, presumably in those 4 cases, either the answer was yes or it was no. And it would probably be useful just to give examples of what in the past was concluded to be, determined to
Sure.
be a demonstrable nexus, to give people an
Sure.
idea.
Sure.
And were all those yeses, or do you know if any of those were?
No, there
no's?
were some no's in there as well. The fine tuning of demonstrable nexus comes primarily from the board's fundraising advisory opinion, and so that's, the example given there is that to fundraise for a not-for-profit organization, it has to, the nonprofit has to have that, that sort of subject matter nexus, as well as a nexus to the city and its residents.
Well, all I'm saying is that a demonstrable nexus is kind of a vague term.
Sure.
More than kind of, and would be useful in the statement to give, obviously you're not locked into anything going forward, but to give some examples of what has been found to be. And you, if you want to bring it from another rule, I don't think that's a problem. If you're saying that it's the same standard, it would just be useful for people to understand what that, I mean, everything else is very straightforward, I think, in the rule. That's the only one that's, a little bit.
Sure, sure. Well, I'm happy to provide that.
Further? Well, I would say, well, I guess we'd need to see it again to see the statement of basis and purpose, so why don't I call for a motion that the board continues this discussion at a future board meeting where we would get some illustrations drawn from prior advisory opinions as to what demonstrable nexus means.
So moved.
Second? Okay, so the motion for continuation at a future meeting has passed. And Chad, take the hot seat. Just going back on the prior one, I don't think that's a big deal. I just think you can very quickly draw some examples. I don't think that is a major change at all. Great. Okay, now we're going to discuss legal force consideration of the proposed amendments to Board Rules 1-07. We've also seen this before, so Chad, why don't you update us on what happened before and what's happened since we last saw this?
So the rule is structured into 4 parts. The first section of the rule defines some terms that are used in applying the post-employment restrictions, defining who the agency served was for a public servant subject to appearance restrictions, and then what constitutes an appearance before that agency, to explain what happens when people appear before government boards and commissions on which representatives of agencies sit. The second section is about when the post-employment restrictions begin to run, when a public servant becomes a former public servant for the purposes of the post-employment restrictions. The third is a new standard to review requests for waivers of the post-employment restrictions. And the fourth is a codification of the practice where former public servants are retained as consultants by their former city agency. It's what we call consulting back. And it's really a structure implementing an application of the government-to-government exception, where the post-employment restrictions do not apply to service with a government agency. So at the last meeting, the board sort of addressed issues more globally, and the staff has tried to incorporate that by, one, incorporating the specific revisions that were requested, but two, streamlining the proposed new rule and simplifying it. It was 11 factors, now it's 5. And trying to conform some of the language as closely as possible to both the statutory authority in E and some of the advisory opinions and older concepts in the historic 4-part test for post-employment restrictions. And because the text of the rule has changed, the statement of basis and purpose necessarily changes. So the statement of basis and purpose has been substantially revised to track the changes to the rule and also to more closely incorporate some of the historic materials, the advisory opinions and waivers.
Yeah, I think that last part was a lot of what we talked about last time, was better connecting up with what had come before.
Yeah.
It's a long document, even the untracked changes version is a long document.
There was I learned on yesterday that when you say print to PDF, it accepts changes. So I have tracked versions. It's perhaps not the most helpful because it's significantly different, but
I think we all have that.
This was emailed yesterday.
All I meant by that is it might simplify, to structure our discussion, it might be useful if we broke it up.
Yes.
And although sometimes breaking it by focusing on the statement of basis and purpose might connect with some of the substance, why don't I ask people if they have any comments or suggestions or questions with respect to the statement of basis and purpose first, before we then turn directly into the content of the rules, and then we would break it up in terms of the different parts.
I guess I could start. Thank you for doing this, because I know at the last meeting, we had a lot of comments, and the red line definitely shows that you incorporated a lot of our comments into it. And I think Eric is probably going to disagree with me, but because I agree that it's tighter, and I think it's better. But we don't have the list of AOs anymore. And I know that's because we wanted to cut it down, and I want to think about whether or not we want to include that. I'm just throwing it out there.
I mean, the list in addition to having it by subject, I thought it was.
No, because typically what we've been doing is we've been saying, like, here are the advisory opinions that we are now incorporating into board rules. And we talk about the 31, it's basically a compendium of 200 pages of documents. And the last one, we had it listed out, and then you had all these parentheticals, and I think that's what led to the length. So do we want to include them in here, maybe in a footnote or something, just to show that these are the AOs that we've been considering? One thing. The other thing is,
Someone could go to the website.
what's that?
Someone could go to the website if they wanted to see them, I guess.
Right.
Well, here's a related question. Are they still in here, but just topic by topic? I thought they were, I didn't count, but I thought they're in here.
They're
just not
referenced.
listed.
They
Wow.
are. I think he's just saying
In
there's a
addition,
source of
list them
law
in a
for
row.
these, or a
Exactly.
source of.
Just-
I mean,
the
there's a
reference
reference
to
on
body.
page 3 about the ones that aren't being included, and
Yeah.
probably, following Fernando, you might just want to have a footnote.
That's what
It
I'm
can all be
suggesting.
in a footnote without a lot of parentheticals, and just say, this
They're in
advisory
here.
opinion incorporate, or substantially incorporates, or distills some version like that, 25 of our advisory opinions, footnote. It
Include,
does
yeah.
not include as that sentence on lines 15 and 16, these are the ones we didn't.
So, Richard, we can definitely put a list, at the front of this.
Yeah.
There are no footnotes available
Because
in
it's
this.
published like a
see.
newspaper article,
Oh.
so
But-
the footnotes,
I see.
That's just
wouldn't-
the format of it, yeah. But we can include the list in the text of the thing. That's not a
Right, I mean,
problem.
if you cut out the parentheticals, which made
It
it
might cut it
longer
down.
last time,
Or maybe,
you could just even have an indented paragraph. I mean, before we get into the heart of it, or at some point early at the front, saying this proposed rules draws from and incorporates the decisions in the following advisory opinions, and then you already say the ones that it's not using.
right.
And it'll add a page, or it'll add a very big block paragraph, but probably.
Or an exhibit or addendum listing them all, so it
Is that
doesn't break
also,
up
is
the
that
flow.
typographically possible
Is
to
it
put them all
possible?
at the end of
Because
the?
it's a lot.
At the end.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we,
just at
we,
the
we
end.
could, I think we could do that. I
Yeah,
don't see any
we can
reason
do
why
that
you
Either
got
to add it at page 3, line 12 to 13, in this indented paragraph, or through an addendum. We'll find a way to add this.
Yeah.
That's not.
Okay. And then the other thing that I thought we lost.
Of exhibit 2.
I will-
Just, right now, it's on lines 15 and 16, it says the ones that are not
Yeah,
incorporated.
right, just so,
Just for the purpose
That
of.
might be
But
logic
they're
places to
all
put the ones.
in
because
the
that's been a
paragraph.
practice.
We're just talking about
These are all
adding
the
them
rules.
again,
This is
now
what
I
we-
go,
what
let's
we-
In an aggregation, so that people can see
You
all
don't
at
have to
once.
go through
Right,
and
and do
find
and check
things.
against, right,
Right.
yes.
I guess
I get it.
less
Right.
counting them up, you could
Right.
just.
Right, that's why I didn't count them.
Yeah, that's no problem. That's easy.
Okay. The other thing, and then I'll let other folks chime in. I thought you did a really good job the last time of explaining like the purpose, the principles behind the rule up front. And it's sort of in later, much later in the document. And I agree with streamlining it, but maybe including a sentence or two or a paragraph or two that reflects what is sort of driving the rule and why we have this rule.
Yeah, we obviously there was a choice. It was
Right.
because we felt like we were saying a lot of the same things twice, and so we
Yeah.
were trying to, in order to keep this document shorter, only say these things once. So everything that was in the original intro is in here. It's just
But it
not.
just got moved up. to
Yeah,
the
and so
front.
maybe there's a way we could do like a little summary at the top.
Yeah.
So let it.
And again, I appreciate what you guys did and trying to streamline it, but it did lose a little bit of the,
What is
for,
it
for,
to add what?
just add a little more of a flavor of the rule, like why we have this rule, why we have this
In
waiver.
the
and what
previous
the
draft, there was
purpose-
sort of a more extended conversation up front about the balancing of issues that comes into concern with post-employment issues, that you're thinking about a public servant's advantage from the city service, about the risk, about how this is sort of a necessary tension whenever you think of revolving door type restrictions, and that wouldn't be
That's
hard.
the first sentence, but saying flesh that out more.
That's right.
Right.
And maybe sort of a small paragraph at Exhibit 2, page 2, between 24 and 25.
Yeah,
So before getting to the board's articulation
Exactly.
of what it's done over the years, including the board has always thought about the balancing of these concerns.
and instead of an extended conversation, maybe just like a sentence or two.
Anything else on the statement of basis and purpose?
I've got just some technical things. First, very simply, on page, when we talk about, on page 4, we talk about the switching side. Maybe that's a little too, it seems to be narrow. I mean, you can't appear regardless of what side you're on an issue. So maybe from appearing before an agency on a particular matter without necessarily using the term switching sides. Because, I mean, you might, in some respects, be favoring a position the city favors or not, but if you're appearing, you shouldn't be doing that if you were particularly involved in that matter. And just a question, I don't have 2604 in front of me, but that includes unpaid appearances? You
Yeah,
cannot appear?
for the particular matter restriction, it includes unpaid appearances. It also includes, it's broader than appearing, it's work.
That's right, it's getting work, yeah.
So
So
it
maybe
would-
we should make that
Just,
a
we just say
little broader.
from working on a particular matter rather
Yeah,
than appearing.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think that might.
Sure.
Not extensive.
Do you want to say whether paid or unpaid?
Yeah, working, paid or unpaid.
Just make it completely unambiguous.
Yeah.
Any more on the statement of basis and purpose?
There's just a missing word on page 11, line 12.
I thought that one too. I needed this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Question. Oh, and speaking of, is there a typo on page 12, line 1, should that be number 3? Consulting for a former agency?
Yes.
On page 15 in D, there,
15, I
Looks
think we're
like-
getting into the content, or you're in
No, no, no.
the markup, you're in the track changes.
no, there's just some
Just a typo catch.
typo catches
Okay.
where they appear to be periods when they're supposed to be commas. There's a couple of
Okay.
them.
I think that, yeah,
Yeah,
I think that might just be
it's the way it's appearing.
ugly photocopying,
Yeah,
but we'll
okay.
double check that to make sure.
Yeah, I suspect that too.
Okay.
So why don't we move into the body of the rule? So just for the moment,
Oh, Richard, one second.
oh,
Yeah, let me hold. Okay.
okay, why don't we move into the body of the rule? The rule has an A, a B, a C, and a D. So why don't we just, with A and B being pretty short, so why don't we focus on A and B initially? That's gonna be page 13, from line 15 on page 13 to line 9 on page 14. And then we can go on to C, which is the longest subsection.
Just on page 14, you say, the board may waive under the following circumstances. It seems to imply that restricts the board. The board may under certain circumstances. And if we said something, and maybe it's just the way I read it, but if we could say, the board in determining whether to waive the post-employment will consider the totality of the circumstances, including. So make it clear that it's the board's determination whether to do that, rather than a restriction on the board. The board may do it only under these circumstances. I don't have the exact language, but I think sort of to make it clear that this is the board's determination and not a restriction on what we
Sure. We'll revise that section from lines 1 through 14 to more closely reflect that, the board in determining whether to waive. And then
Well, it looks like it's sort of 11 to 14, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So it would be phrased broader and not, does not conflict, because right now, is that what you're suggesting as well?
No, instead of saying the board may waive, I would say pursuant to charter, the board in determining whether to waive the post-employment restrictions will consider the totality of the circumstances, including but not limited to the
We
following.
need the determines not to conflict
Where it
part.
determines
But-
that it does not, where it does not conflict.
Yeah, I mean,
It's a little tricky.
right, we never had this to be sort of restrictive
No,
on
I
the board.
understand that, I fully understand that, I just don't want people to say, well, you didn't find it here, therefore you know.
Makes sense. That's doable.
Anything more on C? The
Yeah,
criteria
well,
Okay, I've got some comments
in
as well.
17, okay.
Where it says uniquely placed.
Mhm.
that- At first thought, well, that doesn't sound like maybe qualified, but then in the statement of purpose, it says suited, uniquely suited, so I
Suited
think
sounds good.
Suited?
suited, you know, just to use the same.
One thought is, sort of 1, 2, and 3, the answer that the former employee is looking for is yes, or the board is looking for is yes in terms of the waive, but in 4, it's no. And I'm wondering whether it might be more, might read better if all 4 either read yes or no together. In other words, it's a good thing that there's an identity of interest, it's a good thing that is uniquely suited, and it's a good thing that they won't exercise undue influence, but it would be a bad thing if they posed a risk of harm to competitors. So you might just want to flip number 4 and turn it to the negative. I think it's not confusing, but just for some kind of symmetry.
To flip the report and raise it so that
Right.
the answer would be a positive.
Right,
So
it
the
does
answer would
not
be
pose a
yes.
risk of harm.
Right, just so that they're all going the same
Same
direction.
direction, yeah.
Okay.
On that same number 4, I felt like, and it also kind of relates to Jeff's point about limiting, it seems that this is saying the only potential harm that would be considered is these 2 things. And it seems, I don't think those are the only 2, possible anti-competitive risks.
Something more like such as by, to describe the conduct that the board would be more concerned about.
I
Or-
don't know what, yeah.
Or you might want to maybe, Erica, put a period after employer on line 6. And then maybe put the examples in the
in.
statement of basis and purpose.
Where we're putting all of the examples anyway.
Right,
Like examples of, it just seems odd that it says it poses
Yeah.
a risk of harm
Right.
because of these 2 very
but there might be
specific
other
things.
things.
There could be others.
The only concern with that is that right now, the board has a very similar factor and often requests seem a little bit unmoored to the actual activity the public servant's taking part in. That by providing the more specific examples, it anchors consideration of anti-competitive harm in.
Oh, in the rule, not just?
Yeah, in also in this public service specific conduct as opposed to
I
in a
would
more
just say
general.
the because then, because by saying it's a risk because of these 2 things,
Right.
then if it's a risk, but it's for other anti-competitive, competitive reasons, it's not covered here.
Right. Similar to we're in competition with the public servant's private employer by, for example, and then, that would be the only incentive to retaining these in the rule is that they provide sort of specific, concrete, anchored examples of the sorts of conduct that would be disfavored for public servants seeking post-employment waivers.
I don't know, I kind of like it.
Yeah.
All the
And
examples are
that
in the
was-
statement
that
of
to me was the
purpose.
most
Right.
troubling.
And the statement of purpose now is broader. It gives the idea that there are different kinds of anti-competitive risks because you know how to navigate the systems. I would move it, I like Richard's idea, it's like a period and then move the example, I don't know, but
Okay.
Yep, we'll do that.
I'm not gonna be there.
Any further
Easy to do.
thoughts on whether, I think Erica's point is that, it's consistent with Jeff's earlier point about, you don't want to
Not
unduly
limited.
limit what the board could consider. I don't know whether instances of anti-competitive activity might come up, but why kind of limit the board in advance from considering those? I think you could definitely flag them in the statement of basis and purpose.
And it's consistent with
Yeah.
the other examples,
Yeah.
so that's not a problem.
Just technically on line 5 and 14, where we talk about public servants, shouldn't it be former public servants?
This is page 14, line 5.
Maybe on 5, yeah.
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 No, page 15.
Page
Page
15.
15. Where's-
I guess on.
Well, it's
four-
former on line 4,
Yeah,
yeah,
that-
just to make for consistency.
Not sure
You're
about
you're usually
14.
using saying former, and that may be the one time, or one of the few times it's missing. It's a good thing to be consistent.
Yep.
The
On
former
five?
public servant on page.
Because we've got former actually on line 1 and line 4, and it's just missing there.
Yep.
That's not.
And
I'm
on-
not sure about 14, whether we're talking about,
No,
they
you're,
were public servants
no, I
at the
think you're,
time.
I think you're right about, I think you're right about that one, because it's saying, it would read then, for former public servants who were not fully and formally recused from all particular matters, right, at the time that they were seeking the job. So I think you're right, we're talking about somebody in the present who's seeking a waiver, who, when they were a
Right.
public, right, so it's a
Right.
former public servant. Yep.
And then on the line before that, on delay made by city agencies, so you think maybe taking out by city agency as after undue delay, because the employee, former employee, could also have engaged in undue delay.
The only concern with that is that
Yeah.
the board only reviews requests by city agencies, because the city agency head's approval is necessarily a requirement for the issuing of a waiver. So the board, all of the board's requests are made by city agencies. That was why that's
If the
there.
agency request may come to you, to us, after the former
Right.
employee has delayed for a long time, and I think we
If
look at
the
those
requests only come from
circumstances.
city agencies, you don't have to have by city agencies.
So
Yeah.
it would just be made after undue delay.
Are we ready to adopt basically a bright line? This is basically a bright line rule, right? So if it's undue delay and you're not recused, you're not getting a waiver, period.
Well,
Undue delays.
Undue
I
delay,
guess
the
the
board
undue
has,
delay gives us
the
some
board has the
wiggle
capacity to
room.
understand that, sort of in light
A
of its
fuzzy bright
circumstances.
line
Is it
Yeah, I guess it's a
undue, or is
fuzzy
it
bright
delay,
line
but it
rule,
might not
but-
be undue?
But you know, once we put this out, I mean, that's it.
Right, whether or not,
Not
right,
hard.
whether or not the delay was in fact undue is obviously
It's not very
up to the
specific.
board
Right.
to
I mean,
decide.
the point of specifically Romanet 1 is to prevent the board from feeling sandbagged into issuing a waiver. And the idea is that you wouldn't want to create a situation where somebody can create a problem for themselves. They've taken a job where they're of necessity going to be communicating with their former city agency. And if the board doesn't issue them a waiver, they can't keep that job. To say,
That's
no,
undue delay.
you've come to us on, we received a phone call on your last day of your city job. We don't receive a request for a waiver until 2 months after you've started. The board might look at that and say, we've been deprived of the ability to actually evaluate this on its merits. And because the request hasn't come to us in a way where we're unable to review this on its real facts, we haven't been given sufficient time. We're not going to grant this waiver. That's sort of the motivation of that. In that it prevents people from sort of bootstrapping themselves into a waiver by engaging in conduct that often involves dancing right up to the line of D1, or engaging in continuing violations of D2 while they're waiting for a waiver.
Right, and these concerns are right out of the advisory opinion.
So it's not, we were not requiring people to come to us within X days.
Right.
Which would be a bright line rule, but it seems arbitrary and it doesn't actually provide it doesn't resolve the issue. Really, the issue is when the board receives the request, does it feel like it has the time and the facts to evaluate it on its merits? And if it doesn't, that's undue delay.
Right, it
It's
says
within
that
its
we're
rights
gonna,
to
it says we're gonna
request.
subjectively evaluate the reasons for why you took the time that you said. If we find it's not reasonable, it's undue. If it was reasonable, then it's not undue delay.
Yeah,
And we're basically putting everyone on notice. that
Right,
that's
If
right.
they,
That's the
if they
It's a good
engage in
signal
undue
to send.
delay,
Yeah.
That's right.
there's a significant risk that the waiver will be rejected.
And it's not just the requesters, it's the agencies, that an agency will at times know something is happening, not make a request in a timely way. And suddenly it's an emergency for the agency, but it's the agency that has known about this proposal for 9 months, and the board is the entity that's been deprived of the ability to really evaluate this request on the merits.
It's undue delay, so
Okay.
if the agency convinces us that
That's
in
right.
fact there are good reasons why,
Right.
then we could consider.
That's right. It would just permit the board to look at the facts and articulate what it's going to be looking for, that it has to be, you know, if there is a delay, why?
I agree, I just wanted to raise that we had a discussion, because Jeff's point earlier, when we're locking ourselves into something, I just want to make sure that we're all comfortable with it, and I'm comfortable with it.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable, I am comfortable with it, given the undue.
Exactly,
Given
yeah.
the undue.
If there's a hurricane, it's not going to be undue delay. Which happened when most of city government was shut down after Sandy.
Okay, let's look at D, the consulting background. There I have two very minor things. On page 16, line 2, you say the consulting arrangement for the purpose of either completing, I would change completing to continuing, because it's quite possible that this is like a 20-year project, and some enormous construction project, and they're gonna hold it, they bring somebody in to work on it for another year or so. The project might very well not be, not only not completed, but not even scheduled for completion. I think that is continuing until an appropriate person is hired. I think it's the same point, but it just, there's no requirement that they say, and it'll be done during the time that this person is with us. And then in Romanet 4, instead of saying compensation not significantly higher, which seems to give the green light to higher, I would say either similar to or comparable to, which would allow higher, of course. But I think this, the way it's written out, it gives a kind of an eye wink signal that you can give them an increase, just not too much. They probably
Does two
could.
relate to your one? Sorry. Two, the consulting.
Well, maybe you'd have to, maybe you have to get rid of the complete and say no longer reasonably necessary. I'm not sure what it would be. But I do wonder whether or not a lot of the times we're looking at engineers and people involved in big infrastructure projects. I've noticed that. And some of these big infrastructure projects are gonna go on for a long time. And I guess maybe longer than recent. I guess you shouldn't wanna say the person be kept on if they're beyond completion. But I do think it wouldn't strike me as a problem if someone was hired as, no pun intended, to be like the bridge until a more permanent person is hired. So,
I mean, we would then propose to end it after no longer than reasonably necessary.
necessary, yeah.
To do what, though? To get to, you know, find permanence or something like that,
Maybe
or is
complete
it?
the assigned task, I'm not sure, but.
To complete the assigned task or retain a replacement?
I don't know, but it's
Yeah.
just, they conflict. If we're
Yeah.
saying you have to,
Right.
you don't have to finish it, but you could stay until it's finished, then it's.
Right, so this is.
Or maybe it fits in with number 1, which is complete the work or a replacement has been hired. Because presumably, or maybe it's complete or hired with a replacement.
I like the bridge, I don't know how you
Yeah,
put that, it's the concept of you're doing it as a stopgap so that somebody else can be put in permanently to do it, and then.
and the person
someone
might
else-
be there for 20 years, I suppose. But a lot of the ones we've seen, I think, have been people hired because there's nobody around right now.
Well-
And there's a huge computer rejiggering process, and we need this guy, or there's an engineer, but maybe in a year or two. I was more concerned that the completion is kind of locks the agency into saying that's gonna be done when he's done, but you're right, I haven't fully worked through the connection with little two.
Well, one thing to consider here is that for this section, this doesn't require the board to do anything. This is this is that consulting back arrangement under a pair of advisory opinions that allows public servants, agencies to retain their public servants in this way
Right.
without board
They don't
approval
come to
under
the
the
board.
government-to-government exception. So, you know, those AOs were, I think, trying to have a sort of narrow exception for this, and that's what we've tried to capture the spirit of those AOs in the way that we've articulated here. So, which is just to say, if you, however narrowly you want to do this, remember that they're not coming to us. They could come to us for a waiver if you felt like, so if this were narrow and somebody wanted to exceed it, they could still come to
If it's narrow,
it.
they could come and
Yeah.
say, we actually want him to stay.
Right.
We have another project for him.
Yeah, we want him to stay past the
Right.
completion, or we want him
So-
to stay
This is an express.
for an
section.
unreasonable amount of time.
Right.
Right.
No, so that just may influence the way you want to think about how narrow you want the first
This is
part of
saying
this
you
to
don't
be.
need a waiver to do it this way.
Right.
If they wanted a waiver, they could still come.
They don't have to speak to us to do this. They
Right,
submit a
okay.
letter that's posted on the website is the
It's
proposal here.
guidance of how to do it.
Well, it's the requirements that they have to meet to do this, in the same way that many other exceptions operate with the agency head.
It's not exactly clear that the waiver is available. Though it is, though it's
It depends,
understood.
right, yeah.
Though it's understood, well, it's not, the waiver may be available, may be denied,
Right.
just that the waiver option.
Because we often conclude that the person is not all that special. I would say we often conclude, we have sometimes concluded.
Right.
Which is a good reason to say the kind of the restrictive view of it, because why would you need to have somebody consult back to work on something indefinitely? You know, you can't find a permanent city employee to do these things.
Right. The concern is then you're actually violating the actual prohibition, right? In fact, the spirit of the prohibition, that you've gotten some kind of sweetheart deal from your former city agency.
Right. So not having this thing about completing it, I think encourages this sort of a sweetheart arrangement where you consult back and stay forever.
Right, it certainly allows, makes this broader in terms
Right.
of the, what agencies can do. You know, where to draw the line.
Maybe I'm
Obviously-
misreading it. Does 1 and 2, do they not conflict the way it is? Continuing it and then reasonably necessary, can you change it to task or something? Or do 1 and 2 conflict?
I don't think as written with small one and small two conflict. If
No, as
small one-
changed.
oh, if small one said continuing, it does create a tension with small two. If the issue is that perhaps it's not obvious that a waiver might be available, to leave Romanettes 1 and 2 as is and just add 3, saying to the extent that public servants may not fall within either of these exceptions. or with-
I would add a 6, or if I would add a new 5 or a 6, and put it down there.
To what? Let
What
people
would
know
that
they
say?
can get a
What would it
waiver.
say?
If there's a
Request
waiver, just that if the agency determines it's in the city's interest to retain the former public servant, you know, beyond the
These
condition,
parameters.
you know, that don't,
I mean,
Right.
the thing is, for
Waivers can be requested.
completing could still be a very long time.
a waiver.
If we are talking about
Right.
a huge water tunnel project, completing could be the next 20 years.
Right.
So, and that might still be reasonably necessary because this is a huge project. So if the concern is long time, complete almost gives them more time.
does.
I mean, I think it's more about,
It does.
it's more about whether, you know, it's
I mean, you might
new
wanna s-
business, essentially.
Right, but the old business could last a long time. I
That seems to
wonder
me
whether you
outside
might
the
wanna say
spirit of
continue
what this is, though.
for a limited period of time, and we don't define limited. And let that be worked out over time. But, I mean, maybe to combine 1 and 2, and just say, make the purpose of continuing, for the purpose for continuing for a limited period of time. Or maybe 2, that stays as separate out without actually defining limited. But that's, I mean, to me, my sense was that you might just want somebody to work on the project a little while longer and not complete it. But I think the concern here is more that it not go on forever. My sense is that completing could allow that to happen.
Consultant subject to the conflicts rules.
No.
No, okay, so the concern is not to have somebody who is subject to everything that we're
Right.
talking about leave, come back and continue to do the exact same work, but now not be subject to any of the conflicts rules, right? So
Yeah.
we don't want it to be an extended period of time under any circumstances, really.
Right, we rarely see these
Right.
hypothetical 20 years, in large part because it is
Why would
under
we
the
do it that
under the
way?
current regime, people might fall within the government exception, sort of consulting back then, without a waiver either. So right now, they don't have to seek waivers. This is imposing a structure on what might be right now perceived as having less guidance about how people fall within that exception. So,
If the concern is an extended consultancy, then maybe we should put a limit. Or like a check-in. They have to file 30 days, they have to file it on the site. Then maybe they have to do it every year, like an annual, almost like an annual disclosure. Then we will be on notice if anyone is, I'm not saying, presuming that they're abusing it, but if the situation is arising, we will be on notice of it, and we can take a look at it.
so I mean, then it would read.
Well, we only care for a year. Right, this is a
Oh, that's right.
waiver, right, so once
That's
the year
right.
is up, they can do whatever they.
Because the
they
post-employment is only for a year, so that
Right.
after that, they can hire them.
Well, right, the communication piece of it is
Right.
the particular matter, assuming they're completing the thing
matter
that they
is
were
lifetime.
working
It could be
on.
lifetime.
It would
Yeah, but
still,
they were gonna run into, they're going out, they're accepting gifts from somebody, and then it's gonna turn out that they're not subject to the rules, the conflicts rules, they could accept all the gifts they want, so, I don't know.
That's a good point. I mean, it's not gonna be extended more than a year for our purposes.
No, it would, we just would not have any oversight.
For public
It
servants who are
could.
continuing an actual project on which they're working a city job, it would extend more than a year because they would require, they would need to fall within the government to government exception to continue working on a particular matter, which is lifetime. So if I'm an engineer, I'm working on a water tunnel project,
Right.
I'm
That's the
always.
Same
These
matter,
are-
say it would be.
These are not engineers working on water tunnel projects. I mean, those are private companies that hire, right, these are really
Well,
more
who
the
are
IT
these?
The computer
things.
people.
The computer people who are finishing up a database where there's
Right.
only one guy at the agency who knows how to work this database.
Right, you need that person
And you
to
need that
continue
guy.
doing
Those are
that
the examples
thing.
that we've
That
got.
makes sense, though,
Right,
that's
and
a
the
good
board does
reason
it
to
because,
do it, yeah.
because of the structure of these advisory opinions, these haven't been board matters. These have been staff letters for like decades. So this is something that just has been going on in these limited kinds of ways.
It's often tech people, extremely specialized public servants who know how to do certain things with civil service laws.
Where you
or-
can't just bring in a
Yeah.
replacement, a
Right.
permanent
That's right.
replacement.
And do we have any sense of how long those consultancies last?
They,
Any sense?
they don't require anything
Right.
from the board, so this would require them to disclose it publicly, this would require them to meet certain restrictions, but, the way that the advisory opinions are structured now, an agency is permitted to retain their former public servants directly as a consultant, as long as the compensation is comparable.
Stop for one
It's my
second.
impression
Wait,
that
we're
it's-
off camera.
okay.
It's my impression, Fernando, that they don't last that long because I think for budgeting, for like procurement reasons, for the agency to pay the employee directly seems much more difficult than to pay it through a private firm. So most of the time, that's why this like consulting back but for section, that's
Right.
number 2, developed because it actually seems, for reasons that I'm not familiar with, more difficult to pay an employee directly. For an agency to pay an employee directly than to pay it through a private vendor or someone.
Okay.
So it's my impression that this doesn't happen that much, without any,
Right.
data.
No, I understand.
And because a lot of the people who are in this consulting back arena are retiring, they want to stop working for the city. They are finished with their
Right.
job, and many of these people are brought on as sort of more like this bridge situation where they're staying on for a year to do.
The truth is they like the pension, they want the straight cash. They like
So
the
maybe
pension.
I'll just let that
Where are
complete
we?
versus continue, hang on the table for a little bit, you guys might, I mean, we'll make some revisions of this anyway, you might wanna think about whether it's helpful, and if so, to what extent does a limited two have to be tinkered with to accommodate it, and, or whether you wanna put any, instead of saying reasonably necessary to complete the work, just reasonably for a limited period of time, just think about it. I don't think we've given you clear-cut direction, but think about it. I do, just going to the other point I made, which is, for 4, not to change not significantly higher to either similar to or comparable to. It probably will be higher, or could be higher, but I don't want, I'm not that comfortable giving the signal that it's appropriate for it to be higher, just not too much. I think something like similar to or comparable to gives a slightly better signal, even if the number turns out to be the same. Anything else on D?
One more. We talked about this last time. It's on D2 Romanet 1. The language still seems awkward to me. Does it work to say the private firm was selected by city staff other than the former public servant?
What, other than as opposed to rather than?
You can say rather than.
Because it's right now it says the private firm was selected by the city rather than by, I guess, I'm just not following what the intent of your edit is.
It's just it's
Just
confusing.
the language you think is just not clear.
So,
Okay.
Anthony, with your
It's,
edit, it would be the private firm was selected by city staff other than the
I
former
can say
public
rather
servant?
than, you can leave rather than in.
You wanna add staff?
Is the idea to get away from the city, the city agency, or do you,
I think you wanna make it very personal and specific, that the public servant didn't have a role in selecting the consultant, and then they go to work for that consultant. It's other city staff, maybe it should say, must be selected by other city staff and not by the public servant.
Maybe the way you said it, which is that, now I'm forgetting, but that the public servant did not have a role in selecting the private firm.
Yeah, because it was selected by the city, but in no,
No, just changing that whole line,
Just-
and just saying if the public servant did not have a role in selecting the
Say
private.
that.
well, that might be too strong. I mean, what if the public servant said, oh, I hear you're looking for something. Think about that firm, you choose. They have a role, but they're still not, the selection still being done by the city agency.
Isn't that the point though? Maybe I'm gonna direct you to my, I don't know, the firm I want you to pick, or
Maybe.
should I get
you
hired
could say
by that firm?
did not play a role in the in
I
the
really wanna make sure they
recommendation
don't
or
say anything,
You
then
could
that
say
works.
did not play a role in the recommendation or selection of the firm.
That makes it stronger.
That makes it stronger.
It makes it clearer too.
Yeah, I think it makes it clear.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with
Yeah,
that.
because the way it's written now, I mean, if you leave city service and then join up with the firm, you will have selected that firm, and then you do business with the city. So,
Right.
so this is a little confusing. But I think the language that you seem to be
Yeah.
suggesting now, that as a public servant, you had no role.
I think role
in
is the
that
word,
firm.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
okay.
makes
I think
We'll,
that's
we'll
right.
do that. To the extent I didn't write that down correctly, it's on camera.
Well, we said,
The
okay,
former public servant had no role in selecting or recommending.
in recommending or selecting.
No role in the recommendation or selection of the private firm.
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, good.
Right.
And we can see that happening. Potentially, yeah.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay, well, this is not a complete set of things, but as my recollection is, we wanna fix up the statement of basis and purpose to give a little bit more statement of purpose at the very beginning, and then to make sure at some point there's a complete collection of all of the advisory opinions that are being, in some sense, incorporated into this. We wanna be consistent about the placement of the former phrase for former public servant in all situations where it's appropriate. We want to tinker with the language about undue delay, so it's not just the city, it's just undue delay, but not focus on the city agencies. Want to change waivers, little Roman at 4 to just make it by the employer, the anti-competition concern, so that it doesn't give those specifics. We also want all 4 of the criteria face in the same direction. And then what we just did, to think about complete versus continue, to change significantly higher to something like comparable, and then to rewrite the language about how the private firm was recommended and selected. I may have missed some things, but that's my sense of recap. Based on all that, I'm gonna call for a motion that the board continue this discussion at a future board meeting with the hope that the staff can incorporate those changes, which are not that demanding, I think, for future consideration. Do I have a motion?
So move.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? All right, then the motion for continuation of discussion, with respect to the materials particularly mentioned, has passed. And this is the end of the open meeting.